I think the other really interesting area that I've been working on quite a lot recently is funerary art, and thinking about the kind of the monuments that people put up for themselves to commemorate themselves. So a lot of Roman funerary monuments are actually set up before people die, and they plan them quite carefully. You can see that in places like Petronius's Satyricon, where we had Trimalchio talking about planning his tomb and his funeral and kind of thinking ahead. But on the other hand, quite often things must also have been set up by relatives to commemorate their daughters, spouses, etc. And again, we've got quite a lot of literary evidence for that in things like Pliny the Younger, some of Statius's poetry as well. And so when you're looking at these monuments, it's then a question about thinking, well, whose image is this of the person who's died? Is it their image? Is it how they wanted to be remembered? Is it their next of kin? So are they, if you've got a kind of representation of a particularly chaste and virtuous daughter, is that because our father wanted her to remember that way, or did she want to be remembered that way? So who's thinking about these things? But one area that I've done quite a lot of work on is sarcophagi, which are kind of the marble caskets that get used from the 2nd century onwards in Rome, when there's a switch from cremation, which is burning the body, to inhumation and burying it. And so you get these much larger canvas for sculptural decoration. And mostly these are monuments which go inside the tomb. So in Rome and Italy, they're generally located within a closed kind of chamber. In the East and some other places you do find them outside, but in Italy they tend to be inside. So their viewership, if you think about who's going to see them, is probably fairly limited. It's probably mostly family, but maybe wider than that at the time of the funeral itself. So people might see it at the kind of the actual, when they come to the tomb for their sort of entombment. But they can be covered with a whole range of different themes, things like bucolic themes, kind of erotes, harvesting grapes and stuff like that, that sort of suggest the ideas of kind of a peaceful hereafter, but also mythological themes as well, and sometimes quite unexpected ones. So we find things like, the myth of Medea on sarcophagi, and you kind of think, what on earth is Medea doing on a sarcophagus? How could she be anyway positive? But what seems to be happening, I think, is that there's almost like an excerpting of the bits of the myth. So rather than taking the myth all together, you've got a sort of scene of violent death, which you can see as a kind of metaphor for the loss of whoever's gone. But then you've also got kind of Medea herself making off with the bodies of her children, and that again has been read partly as kind of a symbol of apotheosis, of kind of immortality. Sometimes you get Jason appearing on the sides in his sort of, taking the golden fleece and doing various heroic exploits. So you've kind of got all these different little excerpts put together, which when you take them together you kind of think, well, how does that work? But actually Roman oratory and poetry quite often uses myth in a similar way, when it's sort of taking, you make a comparison and say sort of more tragic than X, sort of drawing things in that way. And so particularly Phaedra, for example, often appears on sarcophagi as kind of an epitome of a grieving mother. Now obviously in the myth of Phaedra and Hippolyta, she has this incestuous love for her stepson, and this is really bad, and it leads to doom and downfall and all the rest of it. But actually on the sarcophagi, that scene of the leave taking between her and Hippolytus becomes almost like the departure of a son from a mother, and she's sitting again on a throne, sort of enthroned, and kind of his going away is her. She's sort of looking away in grief, but that almost looks as though it's a response to the loss of a son rather than the sort of the whole tragic misplaced love affair type thing. And then the letter that he holds, which is an allusion to the letter that he leaves for Theseus to say this is what's been happening, becomes more emblematic of kind of the education, the paideia, and the learning of the boy who we assume is entombed within. And there's some sarcophagi that have inscriptions that actually identify a mother and a son relationship as kind of involved in the commissioning of the sarcophagus as well. So it's a very much a sort of pick a mix approach in a way. It's not necessarily taking the myth in its entirety, but it's kind of picking up on little bits. But then if you think about the educational system and people. So we know also there are mythographical handbooks and like lists of, you know, beautiful youths, virtuous women, kind of. Then they're almost encouraged to think in that way, partly as well, sort of lists of different examples of people. And it's interesting actually if you then think about what's happening in the East at the same time, because they are also using myth, but in much more, I would say, in kind of public contexts and less so in funerary context, certainly. So the sarcophagi in the East, you get a few that have got things like the labours of Hercules on them, a few mythological scenes, but they don't tend to be into sort of narrative friezes in the same way. You do find them on the Attic sarcophagi, which were produced in Athens. You get things like Hippolytus again, but he's surrounded by all his kind of classmates, and he's very much a sort of ideal ephebe, and it's not so much about the love affair or the grief of his stepmother. So they're even though at the same period you might find similar myths appearing in different places, they're being used in different ways.